Good evening. Today is August 7th, 2024. My name is Atima Nada George. I'm a Green Fellow with the Library of Congress. And this evening I have the pleasure of interviewing Ambassador Natalie E. Brown. Welcome, Madam Ambassador.
Thank you. It's nice to see you, team.
I want to begin by asking you to share your origin story with us.
So I think my interest in international affairs really started at a very, very young age. I think, like most kids in America, my parents read to me a lot. My mother worked evenings, and so I would stay up late when she came home from work. So I would sleep in the morning so she could sleep in as well. And as we read together, instead of reading, fairy tales, I mean, we did those and other children's books, but I had a National Geographic children's atlas full of pictures of the world and the continents, and we would go through that in the evenings. And I would just look at the pictures and look at the continents and the countries and the flags and just absolutely curious about them. Like, where are these places? How do you get there? How do you get to see them? And it just fascinated me, really from a very young age. And then when I was 10, we went to New York one summer for a family vacation. My mother's originally from Delaware and had gone to nursing school in New York. My dad was born and grew up in Nebraska, never saw a reason to leave Nebraska, but we took this family trip and we went into the United Nations building, and it was like something just called to me when we toured the building. I remember going into the post office there, buying stuff, going into the galleries and listening to the deliberations, putting on the headsets and hearing the languages. And it was just like, this is an environment that I need to be in. Like, how do you do this? And so from that moment, took foreign language when it was offered in school. We hosted an exchange student, well, actually two exchange students. We had an exchange student from Belgium. I can't remember either the year before or after. My sister was an exchange student in Belgium. And then I spent a summer in Belgium as a high school exchange student. The following year, we had a student from Uruguay live with us for a semester. And so just kind of being in that environment was something that intrigued me. And when it came time to go to college, I was looking for schools that kind of had international programs or foreign language, something that would put me in that environment. I applied and ended up going to Georgetown School of Foreign Service. It's actually applied to Georgetown School of Languages and Linguistics at first, because at that time, I thought I had a capacity for languages. Studying Arabic cured me of that. But as I was going through the Georgetown catalog and I saw Foreign Service, I thought, oh, that sounds even more interesting than being an interpreter or a translator. So I applied for that school, and one of my deans was a career Foreign Service officer, and he encouraged all of his students to take the Foreign Service exam and exposed us to things. And so I signed up to take the Foreign Service exam when I was a junior, just to have that experience and see what it was like. I remember vividly that morning it was cold, it was rainy. When I thought about what it was going to cost me to get to the test site, I rolled over and went back to sleep. Following year, nearing graduation, my mother said, what are you going to do? You need a job because we are done with you. And that was all the incentive I needed to actually go and take the Foreign Service exam and join the State Department. And that's what brought me to where we are here today.
Well, let me ask you this. What was your first assignment in the Foreign Service?
So in the Foreign Service, just for people to know, in the orientation class, you bid on or you rank order a list of countries. And so my degree is in Foreign Service, but a lot of my studies were anthropology and sociology. And I remember a class on Haiti, and I was just fascinated by the Caribbean. So I bid on the two jobs that were in Haiti on the list. Not many in my class were interested in those. I passed the foreign language, I passed the French exam, and we were all convinced that I was going to go to Haiti. I was excited about that until the night before. They call it Flag Day when you receive your assignments. We were at a place that used to be in DuPont Circle called the Brickskeller that had beers from around the world. Not a beer drinker, but the socialization part. And we were going through and comparing who'd been on what, who had what language, and everyone looked at me and they said, "Oh no, you're going to Guinea," because it was an immediate vacancy and I had passed the French proficiency test. And Guinea was a little bit further down on my list, not because I wasn't interested in West Africa, but because the job was administrative in nature, and the thing that raised my concern, like in the information packet and reading about it, was all about the poisonous snakes in Guinea. And if you see one, don't panic, capture it and take it to the general services officer. And the job is general services officer. And I was like, oh no, we're not doing that. But it was Guinea. Like the next day they called my name and held up a flag, and it was Guinea. And I remember saying, that's not Haiti. And it was Guinea, and that was my first assignment as the general services officer.
What does a general services officer do?
So it's in what we call now like the management functions of the embassy. So a lot of the support services needed to maintain an embassy and the residents in that support structure. So I supervised and ran the motor pool. I rented houses. I ordered supplies. I was the contracting officer. So a lot of support, that backbone for the embassy. Managed the warehouse.
And Guinea is a hardship assignment, isn't it?
It was, yes. I think it still is, yes.
Mm-hmm. So did that
isolated?
Please go ahead.
No, I mean, it's still somewhat isolated country, limited infrastructure. The electricity wasn't reliable. We had generators at all of our houses. We didn't always have running water. We'd have water delivered. One of the things, the people who delivered the water were the firemen. Very often, sometimes if people didn't have water, they'd let me know. And on my way into the office in the mornings, I'd stop by the fire station and give them the address and tell them where we needed a water delivery to fill up the tanks.
What did you learn from that assignment?
I learned that I am resilient. It was a tough job. I'd say that for someone, I was still fairly young, brand new to the Foreign Service. I don't think at that time we really didn't talk about mentoring and that career counseling that is more common now. I didn't receive the support and guidance that you receive now. It was tough. As I said, limited infrastructure. I had a lot of illnesses and diseases there. I contracted malaria, parasites, other things, and I realized that I am a tough person and a resilient person, and that I have various skills, and that I'm creative and could get by. I was determined to see the assignment through.
And then what?
And from there, I went to Ethiopia. I came back to Washington and studied Amharic for 6 months. And then I went to Ethiopia and spent 1 year working in the consular section of the embassy. So providing services to American citizens and interviewing people who were seeking visas to travel to the United States. And then 1 year as the political economic officer, working on democracy issues and human rights and women's rights and following labor. And I loved that assignment. I had a wonderful time in Ethiopia, a lot of challenging things, given the freedom to explore like the portfolio to my fullest, also to make mistakes and learn from them, to work with other sections of the embassy, other government agencies. Made a lot of wonderful friends in Ethiopia that I'm still friends with, and unfortunately, I still see some of them when our paths cross. One dear friend from Ethiopia is actually a pilot for Ethiopian Airlines, and serving in East Africa, I've been lucky. There have been times where I've been on flights to the US where he's been the pilot, which has been a lot of fun.
And then what?
From there, I came back to Washington. I served in our operations center, which was created during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it supports the Secretary of State and other Department of State leadership. It's staffed 24 hours a day, and you work in a small team on shifts, rotating through various positions. The editor is someone who, during the shift, writes brief news summaries of what might be happening that the Secretary of State might be interested in. The watch officer, we say, is like first on phones, the person who answers the phone and kind of makes that initial decision as to, is it a call that you patch forward to someone else? If you're receiving an alert, you advise others on your team or in the State Department of breaking news. And then also the emergency action officer, who would be kind of the first person if there was some kind of a crisis to kind of take the lead in setting up a task force room and reaching out to things. So although I think there's been an evolution in some of these things, so maybe people don't do those exact same functions now, but when I served there, that's what we did. So I spent a year working in the operations center, which was a great opportunity to learn how the State Department works, how decisions are made, and to see where the State Department fits within the U.S. government, certainly in foreign policy formulation and execution.
Were there any major emergencies that you handled when you were serving in the Op Center?
I have at that time, like part of a team. Unfortunately, Ron Brown, there was a plane crash that killed him and others when we were serving during that time period. One of the unfortunate government short shutdowns that also occurred during a blizzard. So that was a challenging period. I think kind of one of the, I think we've gotten, unfortunately, a little bit used to the possibility of a shutdown or continuing resolutions, but at this time it was somewhat rare and new, and people couldn't get passports, or they had travel plans and they were reaching out trying to get that or other services, and some of these things the government could not provide because we did not have the appropriations of funding to follow through on these things.
After after the operations center, where did you go?
I became a desk officer, so continuing with working on African issues, I was the desk officer in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Very interesting time period. At that point, Mali had had a successful democratic transition. Lots of interest in it. I know my very first week on the job, Secretary Christopher was going to West Africa, including a stop in Mali. So seeing the visit planning from that end and all those preparations were quite interesting. We also, during my time on the desk, received the president of Mali for a working visit to Washington. So being able to put together that program, of course, there's the meeting with the secretary and at the White House, but other things that you have to do. And it was my job to work with the Embassy of Mali and others to figure out what the rest of that program would look like. So that was quite enjoyable. Another country, Niger, had a coup during that same time period. So while we were increasing our activities and investment in Mali, because the coup ousted a democratically elected government, we were by law required to cut a lot of our assistance. And so looking at how you roll back some of these programs and certainly what that means for people, that was quite eye-opening. And then the other country, Burkina Faso, which was a little bit in the middle. It wasn't, they were being unhelpful in Liberia. And so just trying to manage that and working with other colleagues who are working on those issues. So yeah, it was quite the learning experience. And from there, now, I have to rethink my career. From there, I went to the Marine Corps Command and Staff College at Quantico. for a year. And I think one of the reasons I was interested in doing that, having served in the operations center, having seen what happened in the countries that I managed his portfolios, I managed as a desk officer. State Department planning processes are very different from certainly in the military and the Marines, where they would call the operations center in the middle of the night as they're planning, wanting to know how many people are in country X, and we think like, why are you calling at 3 a.m.? That's a question you can handle at 9 a.m. when people are in the office, but just different planning processes. And I realized at that point that some of the countries or the regions of the world that I was interested in were fragile. Possibility, I thought perhaps in my career of an evacuation, who does evacuations? It's often the Marines come in, and I thought I needed to better understand the military, which was why I wanted to spend some time at a command and staff college. So that was, I think out of all of the assignments I've had, that may have been kind of the most foreign assignment, with a different culture. Different language, different environment, learning all of that. But I got to work with a great group of people, and it was a eye-opening and very enjoyable experience.
Was that a degree program?
At that time it was optional, and so I did do the degree program. So I earned a master's in military studies during that program. So.
And there is a unique relationship between the Marines and the State Department. Did you all explore that at all in your studies?
Not specifically, because out of all the students, I recall perhaps over 200, the majority of Marines, but you had the other U.S. Armed Forces represented there, and other and international students from militaries around the world, and then a few other from the U.S. government. So really at the Command and Staff College, the focus was on, they said, if you go to the Defense University, NDU, or one of those higher level schools, it's a more strategic approach. Here it was kind of more operational. So the function of like, how do you work in an interagency, in an international environment, some more gaming and things like that. But there was a little bit. certainly they call it like they had the entire class, but then we were broken down into smaller, conference groups of, I think we maybe 17 that work on things. And certainly for my group, I did bring in a few speakers from the State Department to talk about issues that were of interest to them, and invited all of my classmates to the State Department for a day so that they could see that side of the coin, something that they hadn't been exposed to.
What next?
What did I get there? I went to the International Organizations Bureau, the Office of UN Political Affairs, and I had just an unusual portfolio. Most of my colleagues kind of had a regional issue. The person who followed developments in Africa, someone who did Middle East or Europe. I had things that weren't regional, that were kind of cross-cutting, arms control, a lot of special thematic issues that were coming up in whether or not the Security Council or the Security Council, like the various presidencies of the Security Council would sometimes have a special focus, manage those issues. Non-self-governing territories, interesting portfolio. So some of the international tribunals at that time, those fall into my issues. So it was a great opportunity to learn more about the United Nations, which is really like that interest in the UN is what led to my career in diplomacy. But also the opportunity to be in what we call a functional bureau, something that has cross-cutting issues as opposed to regional focus, and interact with other offices and other bureaus in the State Department, as well as outside of the State Department.
What were some of the major issues you dealt with when you served in the Bureau of International Organizations?
Again, I think at that time they were standing up the International Criminal Court, so those issues around that and U.S. participation was there. and certainly the non-self-governing territories. Again, there was a committee at the United Nations that focused on these things, which for the United States includes like the, Puerto Rico or the U.S. Virgin Islands that are part of the United States, but not self-governing. Actually, Puerto Rico had come off of the list at one point, and then during this time period, the then governor of Puerto Rico wanted to bring it back to the list at the UN, which was quite interesting politically. This, I know the United States was actually not on this committee at one point. We had come off of it, but there were a number of nations. I recall like Syria was a member where we had serious policy disagreements that were on this committee, and they wanted to visit these areas that were under US control, and we did not support some of the travel plans or other things. So it was very complicated, both domestic issues and international. And I recall, I won't name the general, but it was me, a colleague in New York, and someone in the White House. We were kind of the focal point for the United States on these issues. So that was interesting to really be the ones kind of helping to develop our strategy and the policy for a very discrete issue that not everyone is aware of.
So that means that you spent quite a bit of time in Washington. What was the next?
I did. So I actually, after my first 2 assignments, I spent 8 years in Washington, which is a bit unusual. So I think if people think that there's a kind of standard approach to diplomatic career where you do a couple of tours overseas, come back to Washington for a little bit, go back overseas, like I've done everything, wrong by those standards. I kept thinking about going overseas after these things, but then I was, an interesting job came along and I took it. So after working in UN political affairs, I went back to the operations center, but this time as a senior watch officer. And I actually was one of the watch officers on duty on 9/11, which was, imagine quite a day. And then also in October when we took military action, and bombed Afghanistan. So quite a lot happened. There were some terror attacks and other things. So it was a really, transformative, I guess, pivotal time to be working, to have this view there. And then after that assignment, I went into Arabic language training for 2 years. So 1 year in Washington and 1 year in Tunisia. So altogether, it was 8 years in Washington, which is for a diplomat, for foreign service officer, highly unusual because the expectation is that we'd spend the bulk of our careers overseas.
And you studied Arabic in order to do what, may I ask?
So I went to, year in Washington, 1 year in Tunisia. We used to have a language school in Tunisia, the Arabic Field School. I went to Kuwait as chief of the political section. So that was there. And then after Kuwait, I went to Jordan as the economic counselor. And was assigned there for 3 years, which was a great assignment and not one that I would have ever thought I did because economics was not my strong suit in college. I mean, I took the requirements, I passed in order to graduate, but it was until I studied Arabic, economics, I thought was one of the hardest things I did. I know I actually ended up failing microeconomics as a freshman, thought that was the end of the world, but went to summer school and got a B out of it. So I did redeem myself, but the rest of the other economic courses that I had to take, they were still very tough for me. But I think at that point, I wanted to stay in the Middle East after having studied Arabic. And I also realized as I was advancing that the economic issues were intertwined with the political issues and just kind of so fundamental with everything that is of interest to the United States that I needed to have a better understanding of what that meant for us. And then after 3 years in Jordan, I went back to Tunisia, this time as deputy chief of mission. And so I was DCM in Tunisia during the Arab Spring. And then we also had a terror attack on the embassy during my tenure there. So we saw both the highs and the lows of these political changes. From Tunisia, I went to Italy. We have 3 diplomatic missions in Italy, the bilateral mission, United States to Italy. There's the embassy to the Holy See, to the Vatican, and then there's the US mission to the UN agencies in Rome. And Rome is the headquarters of the UN food agencies. And I was the deputy chief of mission at that mission, working with the World Food Program, the Food and Agricultural Organization, IFAD, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, and then 3 smaller international organizations that were there. So I did that for 3 years. And after that, I went to Eritrea as chief of mission for 3 years. And then from Eritrea to Uganda as ambassador for just under 3 years. This year, I've been serving as a senior diplomatic advisor to the Smithsonian.
Wow. Can we go back to Kuwait, where you were political counselor? And would you talk a little bit about the nature of your work there?
So it's interesting. So when I bid on Kuwait, I think most people know that, 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait, Gulf War, strong ties between the United States and Kuwait, friendly relations. And that was kind of the experience that I anticipated. But of course, by the time I got there, there was another war in Iraq. And Kuwait certainly provided a platform for a lot of our military operations, but it just changed everything in terms of how we engaged and the demands. But I think one of the most interesting things that I enjoyed when I was in Kuwait, were fascinating, was the change in women's rights. I mean, Kuwait is a country where women are not required to wear an abaya or to wear a hijab. I mean, that's a choice that women had, although many did. And women could drive, and they had some rights that are denied women in other countries or neighboring countries. But women couldn't vote. They couldn't run for political office. There were other limitations. They could have a bank account, but needed a male sponsor's approval if they were to withdraw funds. There were a lot of things on that, and women were becoming more and more politically active. And during my time there, women won the right to vote and run for office. And so we did a lot of activity with women talking about these issues. And it was just kind of great to see that social change, to see women speak up and demand their equal rights under the law. They didn't gain full equal rights when I was there, but to see that process start and women become more politically active, it was quite rewarding and great to be a part of it, and met so many dynamic and impressive women.
And then from there, you went on to Jordan.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about your assignment in Jordan.
I mean, Jordan also very close relations between the United States and Jordan. And again, like the war was ongoing, and Jordan very involved. The King of Jordan very well respected within the region, close ties across U.S. administrations. I was in charge of the economic section. We had a free trade agreement with Jordan. Jordan, despite some of the challenges between Middle Eastern countries and Israel, had trade with Israel, and there were strong relations there. So it was just very interesting to see how all of these issues were interconnected, and to work with increasing more American businesses in Jordan and promoting trade and working with other agencies. It was a great assignment.
Deputy Chief of Mission in Tunisia. Yes? That was
Yes.
your onward assignment.
Yes, after Jordan, that's what I did.
The Arab Spring was a time of flowering of at least the democratic aspirations of people in the Middle East and North Africa. How did the mission interact with Tunisians? And then perhaps you could talk about also the terrorist attack, the hijack.
I feel like during my 3 years in Tunisia that I had almost three different assignments. So when I first arrived, it was before the Arab Spring. President Ben Ali, essentially a dictator, was still there. Tunisia was a very closed society. I felt that Tunisians were somewhat suspicious um, of foreigners, particularly Americans. It was challenging to interact with people because the security forces would ask them, why are you meeting with this person? They would follow them and harass them. I can recall just, it's normal for diplomats to meet with the foreign ministry to interact with people, and the foreign ministry just really didn't want to have close ties with us. We had one phone number for them, and when we needed to ask things, we needed to send a formal request, a diplomatic note or a note verbal. And we had a fax number, and that's how we submitted these things, would fax them over. And at one point, they actually unplugged the fax machine because they said we were sending too many requests. And so it was like very closed and a very, very difficult operating environment, very constrained. And then Mohammed Bouazizi set himself on fire, and that started the Arab Spring. Young people demanding rights, concerned about their future. And and led to the Ben Ali fleeing the country. And I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty, but also a lot of excitement. And I feel that in many ways, the country seemingly changed overnight. I can remember one of the officials at the foreign ministry that was kind of my counterpart that I was supposed to interact with, that was so difficult to get a hold of before the Arab Spring, before the president fled the country. The day the president fled, he called me to check in and say, are you guys all right? Do you need anything? Here's my phone number. Here's my cell if you need anything. And I can remember writing down his cell phone number and going in and looking at my ambassador and saying, he gave me his phone number. Like we can call someone, because like we didn't have that. It was so difficult before. And so just really a lot of excitement. It was very interesting, I think, in Tunisia to see that. I think people in Tunisia, and I think certainly in the international community as well, thought that there were a lot of things that the country didn't have, that there was a lot of know-how that they didn't have. And what we were discovering was a lot of that knowledge existed. They just were not able to take full advantage of it. That it was blocked. The people had various degrees. They had studied some of these things. They'd had some plans for developing the economy and other things. And it was just the system that was in place blocked everything. And so just really trying to sort some of these things out. But at the same time, as things were more open, I do know we had some challenges with the immediate government that came into place, the interim government, because they wanted to be very different from what preceded them. So, for example, I recall that there was a former employee who had been dismissed from her job years ago, and everything had been done legally, but she objected to it, and then she decided that she wanted to sue the embassy. And you just can't sue an embassy. It's like the US government. There are mechanisms for doing this. But people in the government didn't want to follow those procedures because they felt that it was the government interfering with someone's individual rights. So there was a lot of negotiation as they were trying to find their way at that point. Like the pendulum went from one end, it swung to the other, and trying to get it back to the middle. And then for US interests, we went from limited engagement to looking, to having lots of opportunities to engage. The amount of resources that we had, everyone saw what Tunisia's success would mean for the rest of the Arab world. And, we saw things happening. And, of course, Libya and Egypt and other countries were kind of going through these transformations. So a lot of new resources, a lot of staff coming in. We were strained because we just did not have the physical space for all of these people and managing these new resources. And then there was an attack on the embassy that was just devastating, did over $18 million worth of damage. And we, went from this growing embassy and lots of engagement to really reducing staff and sending family members home because we were concerned for everyone's safety. So it was a very frightening time, but also I think it limited our ability to continue some of these activities and engagement because we just didn't have the staffing to see these things through.
So, would you care to comment on other assignments? We talked about that first ambassadorial assignment to Eritrea, also Uganda. Just give us a little taste of your professional experience.
Now, well, okay, so I was chief of mission in Eritrea, which for all intents and purposes was, or charge d'affaires, the permanent charge was essentially equivalent of an ambassador, but I didn't have Senate confirmation like ambassadors do. Several years ago, we downgraded our diplomatic relations with Eritrea, and they have a charge in Washington, and we either had a charge or a charge d'affaires ad interim, a temporary charge there. Eritrea is a challenging environment, and I can remember on my second tour in Ethiopia, it was shortly after the dictator in Ethiopia was ousted and Eritrea gained its independence. And when I served in Ethiopia, people used to go to Eritrea for vacation to take advantage of the Red Sea coast. It's a quaint city, the Art Deco architecture, some of these things. But over the years, it has become more and more reclusive. Human rights of citizens and others are routinely violated. Some of our staff were imprisoned. The government restricted the number of people, like wouldn't grant visas so that we could have a really fully functional embassy. It was difficult to bring in temporary support to do some things. Our local staff were harassed. Just a very difficult operating environment. In terms of engagement with the government, like everything had to be approved by the foreign ministry or others. So, as a chief of mission, one would think that I could meet most government officials. And in fact, during my time there, we had a list, and I never got a chance to officially call on several ministers in their office because it just wasn't approved. And there are actually travel limitations on diplomatic staff as well. We were limited to essentially the capital city of Asmara. And if you wanted to go beyond that, you had to file a request and get permission, written permission to do it. And they only allowed us really to go to a few other cities. So, not a single ATM in Eritrea. There's, cell phones, but no data network. The internet was very expensive. We had an American center that over time, before I arrived, and other times when they were not pleased with the US policy position or something, they would force it to close. So a very difficult environment to carry out our work, to interact with people. But we had a small team of 10 people, and we did the best we could. I mean, the Eritrean people, I really enjoyed them. They're lovely people, interesting culture, great food, wonderful coffee. but it's a very underdeveloped country, and that is because the you know people in power are doing that. They um, don't believe in free market, very skeptical of the international system. They feel that Eritrea was betrayed by the United States and others. So it's a quite difficult working environment. But when I was there, things have since changed. But during the time, like Eritrea and Ethiopia did um, resume diplomatic relations when I was there after more than a decade of not having anything. So that was interesting to see that. Then, Prime Minister Abiy traveled several times. The border was temporarily opened. Ethiopians were traveling. Eritreans were able to travel because most Eritreans to leave the country require an exit permit, an exit visa, which is not always granted if you haven't done national service or if there are other reasons. They were able to travel and see friends and family that they'd been physically separated from. Phone connection between the two countries was restored because before you couldn't call Ethiopia from Eritrea. So it's a very exciting period to see some of these changes happening, but they did not lead to that lasting openness that I think everyone was hoping for, in peace and more freedom for the citizens.
But then you did get Senate confirmation for your assignment to Uganda.
Yes, so I did go to Uganda as ambassador. Yes.
Tell me about that assignment.
Also not, I can't say that there is a typical ambassadorial assignment, but when I arrived in Uganda in October of 2020, we were experiencing the pandemic. And so, in fact, like just getting there was challenging because airspace in so many places had been closed. It was before we had an approved vaccine. So my first 2 weeks in country, I was quarantined in my house, not interacting with anyone, doing what we're doing now, doing everything by video conference. So arriving during that time period is a very different work environment with schools closed, virtual learning, and then for public schools, Ugandan schools, they had one of the longest closures in the world. Their schools were closed for almost 2 years, which had an impact for our local staff and their ability to care for their children and provide for their families, managing that. Uganda had elections that were Ugandan elections have always had some violence and been complicated. But again, during the pandemic, opposition candidates, there were constraints on their ability to campaign and interact with their constituents and mobilize, but you didn't see the same restraints on candidates running who were members of the ruling party. And there was some violence. The internet was set down. Normally, embassy staff would travel during an election in country, visit parts of the country, not to monitor, because we don't do that, but to observe and to see how the process is unfolding. We were denied the credentials to do that. So I made the decision not to send out observers. We finally were told that we could do it the night before the election, and there was no way to send people to some of the further reaches of the country. They would have had to drive at night. Not all the roads are well lit. I was worried about the safety of the drivers on the road. I was worried about people not having the necessary credentials if they were out and about. So we did not observe those elections. Yeah, which attracted a lot of international and media attention for that. So we had those elections. Of course, during that time period, we had a transition in our own government from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. The occurrences of January 6, 2021, that happened just 10 days before Uganda's election. I did put out a statement about what we observed on Capitol Hill, in part because I knew we were going to comment on the conduct of Uganda's elections and I felt if we didn't address what was happening in our own country, that we wouldn't have any credibility to comment on what we were seeing in the Ugandan landscape. So that was challenging. During my time in Uganda, there was an Ebola outbreak. Responding to that as well, I learned a lot about public health issues, whether from COVID and the COVID lockdown and restrictions, from efforts to bring vaccines to people. The United States provided over 18 million vaccine doses to Uganda, and getting those out and making sure they got to people and tried to minimize the wastage there. Ebola, I really learned a lot about public health and was very involved in that, and so appreciative of my colleagues from CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and U.S. Agency for International Development for all that they do. What else happened there? And then also another, I think, really pivotal issue during my time in Uganda was the Ugandan parliament passed the Anti-Homosexuality Act, and the president signed it into legislation, which, for all intents and purposes, made it illegal to be in a same-sex relationship, and really put its citizens, many of its citizens and visitors to the country who identify as LGBTQI plus at risk. And the U.S. spoke up very forcefully about that, imposed some sanctions on individuals who who caused harm to people because of this legislation, and reduce some of our engagement as a result of it.
And now you are a senior advisor to the Smithsonian. How did
Yes.
that happen? And what are you doing?
Well, it happened because I applied for the job, and I'm so excited that I was selected. In some ways, it feels like coming home. Before I actually joined the State Department in the year that I was waiting for my exam to be graded, and actually we didn't talk about this, but I'll mention it because I think it's so important. The year, and I'd mentioned that I'd taken the exam in part because my mother told me I needed a job. And it is a lengthy hiring process, but it was a bit elongated because women had filed a class action suit against the State Department, the Palmer lawsuit, for discrimination against women in the hiring and promotion and assignments. And the State Department lost this lawsuit, and they had to figure out how to strive for how to promote greater equity for women, make a more equitable environment for women. And so they didn't bring in any new officers while they were sorting this out. In my orientation class, when I came in at that time, 50% of us were women. It was the first time you had that high percentage of women in the class. So in that time period, while I was waiting to see if I would get into to actually be hired, I'd finished school and I was working for an NGO, but I also applied and was a docent at the National Museum of African Art. So I'd done training there and then was working weekends as a docent. So you mentioned that, so like now coming back to the Smithsonian, it feels like I'm back home in many ways. But the Smithsonian Institution, 21 museums, the National Zoo, and multiple research institutions, although the focus is in some ways domestic, I mean, that's our primary audience. The underlying mission of the Smithsonian is the diffuse of knowledge and information, and most of the museums and the research institutes all do international work, have some kind of connections with other museums around the world or researchers. And so the Office of Global Affairs works across the Smithsonian and all of them in these activities. And so there's an agreement between the State Department and the Smithsonian, and we work closely in partnership. And so one of the things I try to do is to bring some of the Smithsonian's expertise to the State Department, and some of the Smithsonian staff have been speakers at embassies or have traveled, and then also to bring some of the State Department's knowledge and information and expertise to the Smithsonian and the work that it does. So it's great to bridge those two worlds. One of the things that is really a privilege to work on right now is to support efforts to return, whether it's art that has been looted or stolen from countries over the years, or even in 2023, the Washington Post had a series on some of the human remains in the Smithsonian's collection that were collected in the 19th century. And, have no purpose now. So working with the various museums and others to return these remains to their countries of origins, so that countries have their ancestors back. So that's really, it's not an easy task, but it's a very rewarding one, an important one to work on some of these things. And then, of course, what's great is the Smithsonian is just known worldwide and welcoming visitors from all over the world. I've had the privilege to welcome, on behalf of the Secretary of the Smithsonian, especially during NATO, foreign ministers and prime ministers and presidents who all want to come and see the Smithsonian. So to welcome them to the Smithsonian, to help facilitate at times tours for them, or I think sometimes they just want to come in and kind of, be a kid or be a tourist and explore and enjoy what the Smithsonian has to offer.
That is so amazing. We're coming to the end of our interview, but I'd like you to give some thought to the future and consider the person who is watching this recording and offer us your insights about working in international affairs.
I feel so fortunate to have been able to pursue this interest, this passion. I think it's a privilege. And, one of my colleagues, she's currently our ambassador in Peru, always says that she thinks of diplomats as sample Americans, not model Americans, but as sample Americans. And I realize that, certainly overseas and some of the places I've traveled that have been, remote, isolated areas, if I'm the only American that someone meets, I want to give them the best possible representation of the United States and the American people, because we know that, like, what you see on TV or in the movies, like, that's distorted. It's can be romanticized, or it's, part of a plot point of the movie. But to just really have them know that Americans are kind, that we're curious, that we're generous people. So I think that's one of the things. I think that's a real privilege to be able to do that. And certainly as ambassador, as chief of mission, that was behind me. I wanted always thinking about the image of our country that I was conveying. But for people who are interested in this, like, go for it, be curious. And I have been in places that I never thought I would visit, but when you sit down with people, you realize that we all kind of want the same thing. People want to be able to ensure that their children grow up in safety and security, that they can, provide a meal to families, that they can, breathe clean air, that, that they can afford shelter, that they can spend time with communities. The interests are the same, and I think we forget that because it can be quite easy to focus on those few things that make us different. But it's really, when you have that opportunity to sit down and talk to someone, or when someone welcomes you into their home, that's just such a pleasure and such an honor to do that. So I tell people, so if you're interested in international affairs, go for it. Study foreign languages. And mention that I used to think I had a facility for foreign languages, like Arabic cured me of that. I realized that it was quite a difficult language, and I just really wish I had languages they studied. So for younger people, if anyone's watching this, start early, really focus, develop that fluency. I've been so impressed when I meet our new generation of diplomats who have actually, whether or not they've had the opportunity to travel, that they do come in with some of these skills. It's so vital. I meet colleagues from around the world, and they speak, with accuracy, with idioms, fluency, several languages. And I think that's what we as Americans are missing a little bit. And I know we have a big country, it's diverse, people around the world speak English. Perhaps we don't always think we have that need, but I think we should invest more of an effort there. Be curious, be kind, be human, and enjoy it. Time passes quickly.
It does indeed. Thank you so much. This has been a wonderful opportunity to take a look at your life and career. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, team, for having me. Thank you, everyone.